If humanity is not the first civilization, then the most terrifying question is no longer, where are the aliens? The more frightening question is, why do they know we're here and yet remain silent? Perhaps the universe isn't empty at all. Perhaps it's following a rule, one that forbids contact with Earth until humanity is ready. If you want to understand why the zoo hypothesis may be the most chilling solution ever proposed for the Fermi Paradox, stay with me until the very end of this journey. Get ready. Let's begin. Look up on a clear night, stars everywhere, and without even trying, the question comes, is anyone else out there? The math says the answer should be obvious. The Milky Way contains approximately 400 billion stars. It has existed for 13.6 billion years. Astronomers estimate between 100 billion and 400 billion planets orbit those stars, and billions of them sit in what scientists call the habitable zone, the precise distance from their sun where liquid water can exist on the surface. Water, the one ingredient present in every form of life we have ever found. In 1961, astronomer Frank Drake at Cornell University built an equation to estimate how many communicating civilizations exist in our galaxy right now. The result, tens of thousands, not in the ancient past. Right now, Carl Sagan said it best, the universe would be an awful waste of space if we were the only ones in it. Tens of thousands of civilizations, billions of habitable worlds, 13.6 billion years for life to rise, evolve, and reach across the stars. By every measure, the cosmos should be deafening, and yet, silence. In 1960, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, began formally listening. Radio telescopes across the planet were pointed at the sky, tuned to frequencies that travel light years with ease, scanning for any pattern that could not have been made by a star or a gas cloud. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, once the largest radio telescope on Earth, ran for 57 years collecting signals from deep space. 60 years of listening. Not one confirmed artificial signal, not one verified transmission from another intelligence. Nothing. Except for one moment. On August the 15th, 1977, at the Big Ear Observatory in Ohio, a volunteer named Jerry Amon was reviewing a printout of radio data. He saw a signal so structured, so powerful, so unlike anything natural, that he circled it in red pen and wrote a single word in the margin. Wow. The signal lasted 72 seconds. It was never detected again. No explanation has ever fully accounted for it. It remains the most significant unexplained radio event in the history of SETI, one extraordinary moment, and then back to silence. That silence is the core of the Fermi Paradox. In 1950, physicist Enrico Fermi was having lunch with colleagues at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. The conversation drifted to extraterrestrial life, and Fermi, almost casually, asked the question that would haunt science for the next 70 years. Where is everybody? Not a lecture, not a formal paper, just a man at lunch, looking at the numbers, asking what the numbers demanded. If the galaxy is this old, this vast, this full of planets, why has no civilization ever made contact? Why has no one visited? Why has no one sent even a single confirmed signal? The silence gets stranger when you do the travel math. Say a civilization arose 1 billion years before us, even moving at just 1% of the speed of light, a fraction of what any advanced technology might achieve. They could cross the entire 100,000 light-year width of the Milky Way in approximately 10 million years. 10 million years sounds enormous until you place it against the age of the universe. It is less than 0.1% of cosmic time. A civilization with a billion-year head start could have reached every corner of this galaxy and finished so long ago that their ruins would have crumbled before the first dinosaur took a breath. No ruins. No signals? No trace? Statistically, the silence is almost impossible to explain. Think of it this way. You arrive in a city of 3 million people, buildings everywhere, lights on in every window, and then you realize not a single sound. No traffic, no voices, no music drifting from an open door. The city is not abandoned. It is full. But every person in it has decided, for some reason, not to make a sound while you are present. That is not an empty city. That is a city choosing silence. Scientists have spent decades reaching for explanations. Some argue the civilizations are simply too far away, but the universe is 13.8 billion years old, more than enough time for signals to cross any distance we can calculate. Some argue intelligent life is rarer than the math suggests, but the odds of Earth being the only inhabited planet among hundreds of billions strain the definition of probability. Some argue civilizations once existed, but destroyed themselves before they could reach us. That idea has a name: the Great Filter, proposed by economist Robin Hanson in 1998, suggests a near-universal barrier in the development of intelligent life, something that almost nothing survives. Either the barrier lies behind us, meaning civilization almost never gets this far, or it lies ahead, meaning something tends to end civilizations before they can make themselves known. Each explanation carries weight. None of them fully closes the case, because there is one possibility that rarely gets serious attention. What if they are not absent? What if they are here, aware of us, and choosing deliberately, for reasons entirely their own, not to make contact? SETI has picked up signals over the decades. Most turned out to be interference from microwave ovens in the researcher's own break room. The universe, after 60 years of careful listening, has proven quieter than the building where the scientists eat lunch. But that quietness, after 6 decades of the most sophisticated listening effort in human history, does not feel like emptiness anymore. It feels like discipline, like restraint, like something that knows exactly how to stay hidden. The question stops being whether anyone is out there. The question becomes why they are choosing not to speak. And if that silence is intentional, if it is policy rather than absence, then something far more unsettling follows. They know we are here. They are watching, and they have decided, at least for now, that we are not ready to know. But if they are really here and deliberately saying nothing, then maybe the answer is not somewhere out in deep space. Maybe it was left much closer. Maybe it was carved into stone thousands of years ago by human hands that were not working entirely alone. The Great Pyramid of Giza. You have seen it in textbooks, on postcards, in documentaries. The story is familiar ancient Egyptians, working with copper tools and wooden sleds, hauled massive stones across the desert and stacked them into the most recognizable structure on Earth. It is a story of human determination, of organized labor, of ingenuity under constraint. It is a clean, comfortable story, and the numbers make it very difficult to keep believing. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. Each block weighs between 2.5 and 15 tons. The entire base stretches 230 meters on each side, and when engineers measured the flatness of that foundation, they found the surface deviation across the entire base is just 2.1 centimeters. That is a margin of error of 0.009%. For a structure built without laser levels, without GPS, without any instrument we would recognize today, that number is almost offensive in how precise it is. The alignment is worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. The 4 sides of the pyramid are oriented to true north with an error of just 0.05 degrees. Many modern buildings, built with contemporary surveying equipment, do not match that accuracy. In 2023, Archaeologist Chris Massey and British engineer Peter James published research in the Journal of Archaeological Science suggesting that internal hydraulic pressure systems may have been used in the construction process. It was a serious peer-reviewed attempt to explain the mechanics. And even then, their conclusion acknowledged the full picture remains unexplained. That is the Great Pyramid, the one we think we understand best. Now go to Peru. At Sacsayhuaman, the Inca fortress sitting above the city of Cusco. The walls are built from stones weighing between 125 and 200 tons each. These stones were not cut into simple rectangular blocks. They were shaped into irregular polygons with multiple angles, then fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a sheet of paper between them. No mortar, no adhesive, just stone against stone, locked together by geometry alone. The Inca civilization had no wheel. That is documented. They had no draft animals capable of pulling loads anywhere near that weight across mountain terrain. Jean-Pierre Pratzen, a civil engineer at the University of California, Berkeley, spent years attempting to recreate Inca stonework using period-appropriate methods. His conclusion was direct manual labor alone cannot fully account for what exists at Sacsayhuaman. The fits are too tight, the stones are too heavy, the terrain is too unforgiving. Move south to Bolivia, Pumapunku. The stones at Pumapunku are cut from diorite, one of the hardest natural materials on the planet, registering 8.5 out of 10 on the Mohs hardness scale. Only diamond is harder. And these stones were shaped with straight channels, right-angle cuts, and interlocking joints so precise they look like the output of computer-controlled manufacturing equipment. American geologist Arthur Poznansky of the University of La Paz spent decades studying the site and concluded, based on astronomical alignments, that Pumapunku may be as old as 15,000 years. The official academic estimate remains disputed, but nobody disputes that the cutting itself defies easy explanation. Now go to Lebanon, Baalbek. At the temple complex of Baalbek, 3 stone blocks form what archaeologists call the trilithon. Each one weighs between 800 and 1,000 tons. They were somehow quarried, transported, and lifted to a height of 8 meters above ground, where they were placed into a wall with millimeter precision. At the nearby quarry, one block, known as Hajar el-Hibla, or the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, still lies where it was cut. It weighs 1,650 tons. It has never been moved. Modern construction engineers have confirmed there is no crane currently in operation on Earth rated to lift it. And then there is Stonehenge in England. The blue stones used in the inner circle each weigh approximately 4 tons. They were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of 250 miles, across rivers and rough terrain, without wheeled vehicles. Once placed, the monument was aligned with extraordinary precision to mark the summer and winter solstices. In 2021, archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson of University College London updated his research confirming the astronomical accuracy of the alignments, while noting that the transportation methods remain, to this day, a subject of active debate. 5 sites, 5 continents, 5 civilizations with no documented contact with each other, and every single one of them built with the same impossible fingerprints, stones of extreme weight, astronomical alignment, precision that strains the limits of the tools they supposedly used, and a complete absence of any learning curve. That last point matters more than people realize. When humans develop a new skill, there is always a progression. Early attempts are rough, later ones improve. You can trace the evolution, but with these megaliths, there is no rough draft, no phase 1. The earliest known examples are already operating at a level of sophistication that later cultures, in some cases, never surpassed. The skill appears fully formed, as if it arrived without the normal process of trial and error. It is like someone who has never touched a bicycle in their life shows up on a Sunday morning and wins the Tour de France. And when you ask how they trained, they say they just figured it out. Nobody just figures out 200-ton stone joinery. The honest position, the one that serious engineers and archaeologists increasingly acknowledge in their published work, is that we do not have a complete explanation. The tools available at the time, by every analysis, were not sufficient for the documented results. Something is missing from the story, some capability, some knowledge, some method that left no trace in the archaeological record. If ancient peoples really pulled all of this off with ropes and enthusiasm alone, then we have been dramatically underestimating the motivational power of having absolutely nothing else to watch on a Friday night. But if these structures are evidence of outside assistance, then a far more interesting question takes shape. Why did that assistance stop? Why does the record of impossible precision simply end, leaving humanity to build with ordinary methods for centuries afterward? Unless it did not stop, unless it only changed form. Evolution is slow? That is the whole point of it. A species develops a useful trait, passes it to offspring, and over thousands of generations, the trait spreads, bones shift, brains grow, eyes sharpen. The process is patient, grinding, incremental. It takes millions of years to produce meaningful change. We understand this. We accept it. And most people assume that human technological progress works the same way, one small discovery building on the last, generation after generation. The slow accumulation of knowledge across time. That assumption is about to fall apart. Homo sapiens appeared on Earth approximately 200,000 years ago. For the first 188,000 years, the story is almost embarrassingly uneventful. Stone tools, fire, rudimentary shelter, the same basic existence, largely unchanged across thousands of generations of intelligent human beings. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, agriculture, the ability to grow food deliberately, to stay in one place, to build surplus, a genuine leap, but still just farming. 5,000 years ago, writing and the wheel arrived, two inventions that changed civilization. But they took 7,000 years after agriculture to appear. 500 years ago, the printing press and the telescope. Another gap of 4,500 years between major breakthroughs. 250 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, running from 1760 to 1840, steam engines, mechanized production. The first time humans harnessed power beyond muscle and wind on a large scale? 120 years ago, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. 1903, powered flight. Achieved 66 years ago? Sputnik, 1957, a metal sphere in orbit. And suddenly, humanity was in space. 54 years ago, a human being stood on the moon. 30 years ago, the internet became widely available to ordinary people. And today, in 2024, we have generative artificial intelligence that writes, paints, and reasons. CRISPR gene editing that rewrites the code of living organisms with precision. Reusable spacecraft landing themselves on drone ships in the middle of the ocean. Read that timeline again slowly. 188,000 years of almost nothing. Then 250 years of everything. The entire modern world flight, space flight, nuclear energy, computers, the internet, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, all of it compressed into a window of time that represents just 0.1% of our total existence as a species. That is not a gradual curve. That is a cliff. Futurist and inventor Ray Kurzweil has spent decades studying this acceleration. His law of accelerating returns argues that technological progress does not move in a straight line. It moves exponentially. Each advance enables the next advance to happen faster. The curve bends upward, and the data supports him. Computing power, following Moore's law, has roughly doubled every 18 months for the past 60 years. The processing power sitting in your pocket right now would have required a room-sized supercomputer 40 years ago. But the truly strange part is not the speed. It is the synchrony. The acceleration is not happening in one field while others lag behind. Physics, chemistry, biology, and information technology are all exploding simultaneously, feeding each other, compressing what should be centuries of separate development into the same few decades. That kind of synchronized, cross-disciplinary explosion has no clear precedent in the historical record. Progress is not supposed to work this way. Fields develop at different rates. Breakthroughs in one area do not automatically trigger breakthroughs in unrelated areas at the same moment. Look at the specific jumps. From the light bulb in 1879 to the transistor in 1947, 68 years. From the transistor to the microprocessor in 1971, 24 years. From the microprocessor to the public internet in 1991, 20 years. From the internet to the smartphone in 2007, 16 years. From the smartphone to large language AI in 2022, 15 years. Each gap shorter than the last, each step more complex than the one before it. The acceleration is not slowing, it is tightening. Theoretical physicist Michio Kaku at City College of New York has placed this trajectory against the Kardashev scale, the framework that measures civilizations by their energy use and technological reach. His assessment is direct humanity is advancing from a Type 0 civilization toward a Type 1 at a pace that, in his words, has no equivalent in any theoretical model we have built. We are not developing at the rate that evolutionary biology or cultural anthropology would predict. Joseph Henrich, an anthropologist at Harvard University, has studied the mechanics of human cultural accumulation for years. His research identifies what he calls a threshold effect in human cultural learning, a point beyond which knowledge builds on itself in ways that standard evolutionary models cannot fully account for. In plain terms, something in the human capacity for collective learning crossed a line, and the results do not match the expected pattern. Honestly, if someone sat down to watch a documentary about 200,000 years of human history, the first 199,750 years would be the part where people check their phones. The steam engine is where it finally gets interesting. But there is a layer underneath the acceleration that almost nobody talks about. Across the history of science, many of the most significant breakthroughs did not arrive through methodical experimentation and gradual refinement. They arrived suddenly, fully formed, through dreams, visions, and moments of inexplicable clarity that the scientists themselves struggled to explain. Nikola Tesla, whose work on alternating current electricity forms the foundation of the modern power grid, repeatedly described his inventions as arriving as complete. Vivid images in his mind, not rough concepts that he developed over time, complete schematics. He said he could see the machine running before he ever touched a tool. Friedrich Kekulé, the German chemist who determined the ring structure of benzene in 1865, one of the foundational discoveries in organic chemistry, said the solution came to him in a dream. He saw a snake biting its own tail, and when he woke up, he understood the molecular structure he had been unable to solve through conventional analysis. Srinivasa Ramanujan, a self-taught mathematician from India with almost no formal training, produced thousands of mathematical formulas in the early 20th century that were so advanced the global mathematics community spent decades verifying them. Ramanujan himself said the formulas were delivered to him in dreams by the goddess Namagiri. Whether one takes that literally or not is beside the point. The formulas were real, many were correct, and he could not adequately explain where they came from. 3 different geniuses, 3 different centuries, 3 different fields, all describing the same experience knowledge that arrived without the expected process of derivation. If humanity is working from a roadmap it did not write, if breakthrough after breakthrough is arriving through channels that bypass normal cognitive effort, then a serious question takes shape. Not a poetic question, a structural one. Who is providing the roadmap and why? If we are really receiving some kind of pre-existing blueprint, then who is handing it to us and why? The answer may lie in a scientific hypothesis mainstream enough to be presented at formal conferences on the search for extraterrestrial life. One that, once you hear it fully laid out, will make you look at the night sky in a way you never quite have before. You have been to a zoo. You have stood in front of the glass and watched a tiger pace, or a gorilla sit in the afternoon light picking at its fingers, or an elephant moving slowly along the same path it has worn into the dirt over years. The animals are not performing. They're just living, eating, sleeping, playing, occasionally glancing up at the glass without any understanding of what the glass is, or who is standing behind it, or why. They have no concept of being observed, no awareness of the institution surrounding them. From inside, the world looks like rocks and trees and food and other animals, nothing more. Now sit with that for a moment, because in 1973, a radio astronomer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named John Ball published a paper in the scientific journal Icarus. The paper was titled, simply, The Zoo Hypothesis. And what Ball proposed was not science fiction. It was a formal scientific argument, peer-reviewed and published, that offered an explanation for the Fermi Paradox that almost no one had been willing to say out loud. The silence of the cosmos, Ball argued, may not be absence. It may be policy. His reasoning was precise. For the zoo hypothesis to hold, 3 conditions must be true. First, advanced civilizations must exist. Second, at least some of them must have detected us. Third, they must have reached some form of consensus to withhold contact. Ball acknowledged that getting every civilization in the galaxy to agree on anything seems unlikely. But he pointed out a critical detail: you do not need universal agreement. You only need one civilization, old enough, powerful enough, and established enough to set the rules and enforce them. A galactic elder, in effect, whose authority over the policy of non-contact is simply not questioned by anyone else, because no one else has the standing to question it. The mathematics behind this are uncomfortable in how well they work. If just one civilization arose 1 billion years before us and developed the capacity to colonize or monitor the galaxy, they would have had more than enough time to establish what amounts to a protected zone around our solar system. Astronomer Ian Crawford of Birkbeck, University of London, has argued that if the Milky Way has been colonized at all, the process would require a minimum of 10 million years to complete. 10 million years is a long time by human standards. Against the age of the galaxy, it is nothing. A civilization with a billion-year head start completed that process 690 million years before our species existed. The infrastructure for a galactic non-contact policy could have been in place since before complex animal life appeared on this planet. Now consider the 3 conditions in detail. Condition 1 is detection. Humanity became electromagnetically visible in 1901 when Guglielmo Marconi transmitted the first transatlantic radio signal. From that moment, an expanding sphere of radio waves began moving outward from Earth at the speed of light. Right now, that sphere has a radius of approximately 123 light-years, meaning any civilization within 123 light-years of us has already received our earliest broadcasts. There are thousands of star systems within that radius. If anyone was listening, they heard us. And if they heard us, they made a decision about what to do next. Condition 2 is consensus. And this is where the argument becomes more structurally elegant than most people expect. Ball's point was never that every civilization in the galaxy voted on a policy and agreed. The point was that one sufficiently dominant civilization could enforce non-contact the way a government enforces a protected territory. You do not need the agreement of every nation on Earth to keep people off North Sentinel Island. You need one authority with the will and the reach to enforce the boundary. Condition 3 is non-interference, and this is where the hypothesis stops being abstract and becomes something recognizable, because we already practice exactly this principle ourselves. North Sentinel Island sits in the Andaman Sea, part of Indian territory in the Indian Ocean. It is home to the Sentinelese, a group estimated at between 50 and 100 people who have maintained complete isolation from the outside world for an estimated 50,000 years. They reject all contact. They have killed people who came too close. The government of India has responded not with force, but with legal protection. Approaching within 3 nautical miles of the island is prohibited. The Sentinelese do not know smartphones exist. They do not know the internet exists. They have no awareness of COVID-19, of nuclear weapons, of any event in recorded human history. From inside their world, the outside world simply does not exist. From the outside, they are being watched, mapped, studied from a distance, and actively shielded from contact they did not ask for and could not process safely. We are the Sentinelese of the galaxy. That comparison is not poetry. It is a structural parallel that holds at every level. A more advanced civilization looking at us from a distance, choosing protection over contact, enforcing a boundary we cannot see, for reasons they consider sound even if we would not immediately agree with them. And here is why non-contact is not indifference. It is, in fact, the most ethically defensible position available. When European civilizations made contact with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the consequences were catastrophic in a way that had almost nothing to do with intent. Within 150 years of first contact, approximately 90% of the indigenous population had died, not primarily from warfare, though there was warfare, but from disease, from cultural collapse, from the complete disorientation of encountering a world so different from everything they had built their identity around that the psychological damage was itself fatal at a civilizational scale. The people doing the contacting did not need to be malicious to cause destruction on that scale. They just needed to be sufficiently different and to arrive before the receiving culture had any framework to absorb the shock. Now scale that up. A Type 3 civilization on the Kardashev scale controls energy at the level of an entire galaxy. Their technology, their biology, their way of processing reality would be to us what a smartphone is to a Neanderthal. Not threatening, necessarily, not hostile, just so far beyond our current framework that contact itself, regardless of intention, could shatter the cognitive and social structures that hold human civilization together. The kindest thing a vastly superior civilization can do with a younger one is leave it alone until it is ready. Not because the younger civilization is worthless, because it is not yet ready to handle what contact actually means. Though, to be honest, if any civilization out there has been monitoring our social media comment sections and watching what we do with the ability to communicate anonymously, they may have simply updated their timeline and added a few more centuries to the waiting period. But here is what makes the zoo hypothesis more than just a neat intellectual exercise. It actually explains something that no other framework cleanly accounts for. Not just why they are silent, but why they would specifically want to keep us intact, unchanged, developing on our own. The answer to that question involves something that cannot be manufactured, cannot be replicated, and may be the single most valuable thing in the known universe. And it has nothing to do with resources. When a species goes extinct, it is gone permanently. Not diminished, not reduced, gone, in a way that no amount of technology or intention can reverse. This is why conservation exists. Not because every endangered animal has immediate practical utility. Not because the northern white rhinoceros or the Amur leopard produces something we need next quarter, but because each species represents a biological solution, refined over millions of years of evolution, to the specific problem of surviving in a specific environment. Lose the species, lose the solution, forever. We understand this instinctively when it comes to animals. The logic of preserving diversity, of protecting what is irreplaceable simply because it is irreplaceable, is built into how we think about the natural world. Now apply that same logic to civilizations. Every culture that develops independently, in isolation from others, produces its own cognitive architecture, its own way of framing problems, its own categories for understanding time and space and cause and effect, its own methods for building consensus, resolving conflict, and making meaning out of suffering. These frameworks are not interchangeable. They are not just different aesthetics layered over the same underlying logic. They are structurally distinct ways of processing reality. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in linguistics proposes that language does not just describe thought, it shapes it. The words available to you influence what distinctions you are capable of making. Linguist Lara Boroditsky at the University of California, San Diego, has spent years testing this empirically. Her research demonstrates that speakers of different languages do not merely label the same experiences differently. They actually perceive color, track the passage of time, and orient themselves in physical space through measurably different neural processes. Russian speakers, who have separate words for light blue and dark blue, distinguish those shades faster in cognitive tests than English speakers do. The Cook-Thaayora people of Australia, who use cardinal directions rather than relative terms like left and right, maintain an almost automatic awareness of their geographic orientation that speakers of most European languages simply do not develop. Language is not decoration over thought. Language is part of the machinery of thought itself, which means every distinct civilization, with its distinct language and history and set of pressures that shaped its development, is not just culturally different, it is cognitively different. It processes the universe through a lens that no other civilization has built in quite the same configuration. A galaxy full of diverse civilizations, each developing independently, is not just an interesting sociological fact. It is a library, an enormous, irreplaceable archive of different approaches to the fundamental problems of existence. Lose one civilization to premature contact, to cultural collapse, to the overwhelming force of a more dominant neighbor, and you have not just lost a people, you have lost a perspective that took billions of years and an entire planetary history to produce. Now consider the paradox that faces any civilization old enough to be advanced. Progress converges. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of scientific development. Logic has right answers. Mathematics has proofs that are either valid or not. Physics describes a universe that behaves consistently regardless of who is observing it. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more its understanding of reality is pulled toward the same conclusions, the same frameworks, the same fundamental descriptions of how things work. A civilization 1 billion years old has likely exhausted most of the questions that have definitive answers. They have solved what can be solved. They have mapped what can be mapped. And in doing so, they may have lost something that cannot be recovered through further advancement. Spontaneity? Surprise? The particular kind of creativity that comes only from not knowing the answer yet. A civilization that old may have optimized itself out of the capacity for genuine artistic creation, not because they lack intelligence, But because authentic art is inseparable from uncertainty, from pain, from the experience of being finite and unresolved and still trying anyway, take away the uncertainty and you take away the raw material. Consider what jazz is. It did not emerge from comfort or planning. It grew out of the specific suffering of Black Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from the collision of African musical tradition with European harmonic structure, filtered through the particular social and economic conditions of New Orleans and Chicago and New York at that exact moment in history. That combination of pressures, that precise historical crucible, produced something that had never existed before and could not have been predicted by anyone watching from the outside. Blues carried the weight of the same history. Rock and roll erupted from the tension between those same roots and a post-war American culture struggling to define itself. Hip-hop was born from the South Bronx in the 1970s, from poverty and political abandonment and the human refusal to be silent about either. None of these art forms could have been engineered. They could only have been lived into existence. William Faulkner wrote out of the specific grief and guilt of the American South. Toni Morrison wrote out of the specific experience of Black womanhood in a country that had spent centuries refusing to see it. Gabriel Garcia Marquez built entire fictional worlds from the oral traditions and political violence and magical thinking of mid-20th century Colombia. These works are not just aesthetically valuable. They are irreplaceable records of what it felt like to be human in a specific place at a specific time. Records that no artificial reconstruction could replicate because the experience itself cannot be recreated. An advanced civilization may understand all of this perfectly, may in fact envy it with something that functions like longing. They have the knowledge. They may no longer have the rawness required to produce what we produce. Astronomer Stephen Webb at the University of Portsmouth addressed this in his 2002 book, Where is Everybody?, updated in 2015. Webb proposed that advanced civilizations may actively seek to collect developing civilizations the way a museum collects living cultural artifacts, not out of condescension, out of genuine recognition that what a young, struggling, unfinished civilization produces is something that cannot be manufactured or stored or reproduced once it is gone. Each inhabited world in the galaxy is a unique experiment, a singular result of billions of years of contingent history that will never be repeated. From this angle, everything humanity has ever done takes on a different weight. Every war and every peace treaty, every scientific breakthrough arrived at through decades of failure, every piece of music written in grief, every novel that tried to say something true about what it costs to be alive, every act of courage performed by someone who had every reason to give up. All of it, from the outside looking in, is data of the rarest kind. Not data in the cold sense, data in the sense of a record of something irreplaceable, something that only exists because it was allowed to develop without interference, under its own pressure, on its own timeline. We are not being protected because we are weak. We are being protected because we are singular. The emotions that run through human experience, love and fear and hope, and the particular anguish of losing someone and somehow continuing to function anyway, may be exactly what a billion-year-old civilization has lost the capacity to feel in any raw, unmediated form. What we experience as ordinary Tuesday afternoon sadness may register, from a sufficient distance, as something extraordinary, something to be preserved rather than interrupted. Think of an adult watching children play, not intervening, not correcting, not rushing in with the right answer every time a child makes a mistake or falls down. Because any adult who has thought about it clearly understands that the falling down is not the obstacle to development. It is the mechanism of it. The stumbling is where the real learning happens, in ways that no instruction can replicate. Somewhere in the galaxy, there is almost certainly a playlist that includes Smash Mouth's All Star, filed carefully under irreplaceable cultural heritage. And whoever curated it is completely serious about that classification. But if they are watching us this carefully, protecting us this deliberately, preserving every stumble and breakthrough and strange creative impulse we produce, then how have we never actually caught them at it? How has something this vast, this organized, this present, managed to stay completely invisible? The answer might make you look at every unexplained video on the internet in a way you never quite have before. UFOs used to be a punchline, late-night talk show material, the territory of people in tinfoil hats and grainy home videos and breathless tabloid headlines. If you took the subject seriously in public, you risked your credibility. Scientists dismissed it. Journalists mocked it. The cultural consensus was firm, reasonable people did not entertain the idea. That consensus ended on July 26, 2023. On that date, a formal hearing took place before a subcommittee of the United States House of Representatives. The subject was unidentified aerial phenomena, the official government terminology that replaced UFO in institutional language. The witnesses were not hobbyists or conspiracy theorists. They were military officers and intelligence professionals, people who had spent careers operating inside the most sensitive institutions in the American national security apparatus. And what they said, under oath, in front of Congress, was not ambiguous. David Grush, a former intelligence officer who had worked on the UAP task force within the Department of Defense, testified that the United States government is in possession of materials and biological remains of non-human origin, not suspected, not theorized. He used the word possession. He stated that he had been denied access to certain programs and subsequently faced retaliation for pursuing the information through official channels. His testimony was given under oath. Making false statements to Congress under oath is a federal crime. Ryan Graves, a former Navy F/A-18 pilot, testified that unidentified aerial phenomena are not rare events. They appear in restricted American airspace regularly, daily, in some periods. He described a culture within military aviation in which pilots who reported such sightings were discouraged from doing so because the professional consequences of being associated with UAP reports were understood to be serious. The objects were there. The reporting was suppressed. Those two facts existed simultaneously for years. David Fravor, a retired Navy commander and F/A-18 pilot with 18 years of flight experience, described an encounter that took place in November 2004 over the Pacific Ocean west of San Diego. The object he encountered had no wings, no visible propulsion system, no exhaust. It was white, approximately 40 feet long, shaped roughly like a tic-tac breath mint. It descended from approximately 80,000 feet to just above the ocean surface in under 1 second. Fravor, an experienced combat pilot who had seen everything military aviation could produce, said he had no explanation for what he witnessed. His account is corroborated by radar data, by the testimony of other crew members, and by infrared footage released by the Pentagon in 2017. These are not anonymous sources. These are named, credentialed individuals testifying before Congress on the record. The physical data surrounding UAP sightings makes the accounts harder to dismiss, not easier. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence published its first unclassified UAP report in 2021, covering 144 incidents reported by military personnel between 2004 and 2021. The report confirmed that the majority of cases remained unexplained. A follow-up report in 2022 expanded the case count to over 510 incidents, with the same conclusion. No conventional explanation fits the data. The physical characteristics documented across multiple incidents fall entirely outside the envelope of known human technology. Speeds measured between Mach 14 and Mach 17. which translates to over 17,000 miles per hour. Achieved without any detectable heat signature, combustion, or propulsion system. Direction changes executed at accelerations exceeding 600 g-force. For context, the human body begins to lose consciousness at approximately 9 g. A fighter jet pulling 9 g pushes pilots to the edge of blackout. 600 g applied to any human body would be instantly and completely fatal. These objects execute those maneuvers without any evidence of stress on the craft's structure. They operate underwater, transitioning between submerged and airborne states without changing configuration, without the cavitation signatures that any known underwater vehicle produces at speed. They emit no heat, no sound, no plasma, no electromagnetic signature consistent with any propulsion system we understand. The behavior pattern is where things become specifically interesting. These objects do not appear randomly. They cluster around particular locations and particular moments. In 1967, at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, a flight of 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles simultaneously lost launch capability. Guidance systems went offline. The missiles were rendered inoperable. At the same time, security personnel reported a UAP hovering directly above the facility. Captain Robert Salas, who was on duty in the Underground Launch Control Center during the incident, testified about this event at congressional hearings in 2023. His account is consistent with declassified Air Force documentation. In December 1980, at RAF Bentwaters in England, a joint United States and British nuclear storage facility, multiple military personnel witnessed a structured craft in Rendlesham Forest adjacent to the base over several consecutive nights. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, filed an official memorandum describing the incident. The Halt memo was eventually declassified. Halt himself has stated publicly that he believes the object was not of human manufacture. The Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station in Arizona, the largest nuclear power plant in the United States by electricity output, has had UAP activity confirmed by the Federal Aviation Administration. The objects were tracked monitoring the facility from above. Nuclear weapons development, nuclear storage, nuclear power generation. The pattern is consistent across decades and across continents. Whatever these objects are, they are specifically attentive to humanity's management of nuclear technology. That is not random distribution. Random distribution would produce sightings spread evenly across geography and time. What the data shows instead is selective attention. Presence at the moments that matter. Observation concentrated precisely where humanity is operating at the edge of its most dangerous capabilities. A wildlife researcher deploying drones over a nature reserve does not land the drone in the middle of the herd. The researcher stays above, stays quiet, stays out of the behavioral loop of the animals being studied. The animals notice something. Occasionally, they look up. Then they go back to what they were doing. The drone remains. The data continues to be collected. The deer have no framework for understanding what a drone is or why it is there. The funniest part of this entire 70-year story is the following. For 70 years, the American public was told that people who reported UAP sightings were unreliable, confused, or mentally unstable. For those same 70 years, the United States government was quietly cataloging those reports in classified files, running formal investigative programs, and apparently recovering physical materials from incidents. The people being called unreliable were describing something real. The institution calling them unreliable was simultaneously treating the subject as serious enough to classify. Exactly who was being unreasonable in that arrangement is now a genuinely open question. But UAP are not the only things watching us. If you want to find the oldest documented evidence of this kind of observation, it was not recorded by a camera or a radar system. It was written by hand. pressed into clay tablets, thousands of years before ancient Egypt existed. Mythology is how early humans explained what they could not otherwise account for. Thunder became the anger of gods. Disease became divine punishment. The sun became a chariot driven across the sky. These are understandable attempts by pre-scientific minds to build frameworks for a world they lacked the tools to analyze. The stories vary by culture. The metaphors differ. The details shift. Except for one category of story. That one stays almost exactly the same. The Sumerian civilization arose in Mesopotamia, in the region that is now southern Iraq, approximately 5,500 years ago. It is among the earliest complex civilizations in the human record, and it left behind an extensive body of written text pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform script. Among the most prominent figures in Sumerian cosmology are the Anunnaki, a group of beings whose name translates directly as those who came from heaven to earth. The Anunnaki are described in Sumerian texts as arriving from the sky, establishing order, and transmitting to human beings the foundational knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy. These were not vague spiritual abstractions. The texts describe specific technologies, specific knowledge transfers, specific interactions between the Anunnaki and human populations. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University and Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, two of the most respected Sumerian scholars of the 20th century, produced direct translations of these texts. The language of descent from the sky, of beings distinct from humans arriving with technical knowledge, is not interpretive overlay. It is in the source material. The Hebrew Bible describes two groups that have generated significant scholarly debate. The Nephilim, whose name in Hebrew means the fallen ones or those who came down, appear in the 6th chapter of Genesis in a context that has never been fully resolved by theological interpretation. The Bene Elohim, translated as sons of the divine beings, are described as interacting with human populations in ways that produce consequences across generations. In the 1st chapter of Ezekiel, the prophet describes an encounter with what he calls a wheel within a wheel, a construction of interlocking rings that moves in any direction without turning, covered with eyes, accompanied by living creatures and fire. Theologians have interpreted this passage for centuries. Engineers who have read it without the theological framework have noted that the mechanical description, whatever it refers to, is strikingly specific in ways that pure metaphor rarely is. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in the Hindu tradition, composed approximately 3,500 years ago in Sanskrit, contains extensive descriptions of Vimana, flying vehicles used by divine figures. The descriptions include operational details: how the craft move, how they are guided, how they are used in aerial combat. Dr. V. Raghavan of the University of Madras spent years studying the original Sanskrit texts and concluded that the descriptions of flying vehicles in Vedic literature are too technically specific to be dismissed as pure allegory. Whatever the ancient authors were describing, they were attempting to describe something they had actually encountered, or that had been passed down through generations from those who had. The Maya Popol Vuh, the creation account of the Quiche Maya people, describes beings called the creators who arrive from above and attempt to make humanity through a series of iterations, adjusting their approach each time the result fails to meet their criteria. The account reads less like religious mythology and more like a documented experimental process, with the creators evaluating outcomes and modifying their method accordingly. In Mali, in West Africa, the Dogon people hold astronomical knowledge that was formally recorded by French anthropologist Marcel Griol of the University of Paris in 1930. Among the cosmological information the Dogon possessed was detailed knowledge of Sirius B, the white dwarf companion star of Sirius. Sirius B is invisible to the naked eye. It was first detected by Western astronomy in 1862 using telescope technology. The Dogon knew of its existence, described its orbital period accurately, and incorporated it into their cosmological framework generations before any Western astronomer confirmed it. Where that knowledge came from has never been satisfactorily explained through conventional means. Now step back and look at what these 5 traditions have in common. They come from Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East, the Indian subcontinent, Mesoamerica, and sub-Saharan Africa. There is no documented contact between the Sumerian civilization and the Maya. There is no evidence of cultural exchange between the Dogon and the authors of the Rig Veda. These traditions developed independently, separated by thousands of miles and, in some cases, thousands of years. And yet the accounts share 5 specific elements with a consistency that is statistically difficult to explain as coincidence. First, the beings come from the sky or from the stars, not from the earth or the sea. Second, they appear physically distinct from humans, or are described as wearing unusual coverings. Third, they bring technical knowledge, specifically in the areas of agriculture, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, the precise foundations of civilization. Fourth, they do not stay. They depart after a period of interaction. Fifth, they indicate they will return. 5 specific elements. Multiple independent traditions, no communication between them. Carl Sagan, in the 1966 book Intelligent Life in the Universe, co-authored with Soviet astrophysicist Iosif Shklovsky, directly addressed this pattern. Sagan, one of the most rigorous scientific minds of his generation, and not someone given to unsupported speculation, wrote seriously about the possibility that some ancient myths may preserve genuine memories of contact with non-human intelligences. He did not assert it as fact. He treated it as a hypothesis worth taking seriously. That alone is significant. Consider the logic of convergence. If 20 people in 20 countries who have never met each other all describe the same dream in the same detail, with the same characters and the same sequence of events, the word coincidence stops being adequate. At some point, the honest question becomes not why they are all saying the same thing, but what the common source of that shared account might be. What is almost charming, in a particular way, is that across nearly all of these traditions, the visitors from the sky apparently took the time to teach humanity how to grow food and calculate the movements of celestial bodies, but somehow never got around to teaching humans how to reach political consensus with each other. Perhaps some problems are simply beyond the scope of even a galactic civilization's technical curriculum. But if these observers visited us thousands of years ago, they may have left something behind when they departed. Not gold, not weapons, something considerably stranger than either, something that science keeps pulling out of the ground and genuinely does not know how to explain. Geology reads time through rock. Each layer of sediment represents a period, deposited over thousands or millions of years, compressed by weight and time into stone. If you find a dinosaur fossil in a layer dated to 65 million years ago, you know when that animal lived. The system is precise, consistent, and has been validated across 2 centuries of scientific research. It is one of the most reliable tools in all of Earth science, which makes what has been pulled out of those layers genuinely difficult to process. In 1974, workers digging along the banks of the Moors River near Aiud, Romania, discovered 3 objects buried together approximately 33 feet below the surface. 2 of them were immediately identifiable mastodon bones, the remains of an ancient elephant-like animal. The 3rd object was not identifiable at all. It was a wedge-shaped piece of metal, roughly 8 inches long, with 2 holes offset from each other at different angles. The local institute sent it for analysis at the Archaeological Institute of Cluj. The results came back and the researchers read them twice. The object was 89% aluminum, alloyed with 12 other elements, including copper, zinc, lead, cadmium, nickel, and bismuth in a configuration that does not occur in nature. The geological context placed it at approximately 11,000 years old, consistent with the mastodon remains found alongside it. The findings were eventually published in the Romanian journal Cercetare Istorice. In 1995, the problem is fundamental and does not go away with closer examination. Aluminum in its pure or alloyed form does not exist naturally in the Earth's crust. Extracting aluminum from ore requires industrial electrolysis. That process was not developed until 1825. The object's shape, with its offset holes and angled geometry, has been compared by analysts to the landing strut of an aircraft. No one has produced a satisfying conventional explanation for its existence. In 1998, a team of Russian geologists working in the Kaluga region north of Moscow recovered a screw-shaped metallic object embedded completely within rock. The rock formation was dated at between 300 million and 320 million years old. At that point in Earth's history, complex land-based animal life had barely begun to establish itself. The first amphibians were just beginning to move onto land. There were no vertebrates with hands. There were certainly no beings capable of manufacturing a threaded metal fastener. Analysis conducted at the Russian Institute of Physics identified the metal as a molybdenum-tungsten alloy. Molybdenum-tungsten alloys are used today in high-temperature industrial applications. They do not form naturally. They are engineered materials. The Antikythera mechanism is better known, but its implications have still not fully penetrated public understanding. Recovered from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, it was initially dismissed as a corroded lump of bronze. Decades of subsequent analysis revealed it to be a mechanical computing device containing 37 precision bronze gears arranged to calculate the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the timing of astronomical events, including eclipses. In 2021, a team at University College London published a complete reconstruction of the device in the journal Scientific Reports, confirming that the mechanism's complexity exceeds anything else known from the ancient world by a margin of more than 1,000 years. The level of precision gear cutting required to build it did not reappear in documented human technology until the 14th century. Whatever workshop produced the Antikythera mechanism, it was operating with knowledge and manufacturing capability that the civilization surrounding it does not appear to have possessed. In 1936, German archaeologist Wilhelm König, working at the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, came across a collection of clay jars that had been excavated near the village of Kujut Rabu. Each jar contained a copper cylinder capped with asphalt, with an iron rod suspended inside. König recognized the configuration. In 1940, Willard Gray at General Electric reconstructed one of the jars and filled it with an acidic solution. It produced between 1.5 and 2 volts of direct current electricity. The jars, dated to somewhere between 250 BCE and 640 CE, functioned as electrochemical cells. Electrical science as a formal discipline did not begin until Alessandro Volta built his first battery in 1800. Whatever the Baghdad batteries were used for, the underlying principle they demonstrate was understood and applied more than 1,000 years before we thought anyone knew about it. On June 11, 1891, the Morrisonville Times in Illinois published a brief account submitted by a local woman named Mrs. S. W. Culp. She had been breaking apart a large lump of coal when it split open to reveal a delicate gold chain, approximately 10 inches long, of an intricate and clearly manufactured design. Coal seams in Illinois formed between 300 million and 310 million years ago. During the Carboniferous period, when the dominant life forms on land were insects, amphibians, and early reptiles, nothing that could have made a gold chain existed. Two explanations exist for every one of these objects. The first is that each case has an error, a contamination, a misidentification, a fraud, or a geological anomaly that accounts for the anomalous result. This explanation is applied individually to each case, and for any single case, it cannot be ruled out. Rocks crack. Sediment layers are occasionally disturbed. Objects can be inserted into spaces by natural processes that look deceptive. Fraud happens. The second explanation is that advanced technology has existed on Earth before, more than once, and the geological record has mostly erased it. The maddening logical point is this: if even one of these objects is exactly what its context suggests it is, then the entire established timeline of human technological development is incomplete in a way that changes everything downstream from it. Astrophysicist Adam Frank of the University of Rochester and climatologist Gavin Schmidt of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies published a paper in the International Journal of Astrobiology in 2019 that took this question seriously at a scientific level. They asked what geological evidence a prior industrial civilization would actually leave behind after tens of millions of years. Their conclusion was sobering. Plastics would degrade. Metal structures would corrode and disperse. Buildings would erode to dust. Isotopic ratios in certain geological layers might show anomalous signatures, but those would be subtle and easy to misattribute. A civilization that rose and fell 30 million years ago might leave almost no recoverable evidence of its existence by today. They called this the Silurian hypothesis, a reference to an old science fiction concept. But the paper itself was not fiction. It was a peer-reviewed scientific argument that the absence of evidence for a prior civilization does not constitute evidence of absence, because our tools for detecting such evidence may be fundamentally inadequate to the task. Think about what our own civilization would leave behind if it ended today. Certain plastics will persist for hundreds of thousands of years. Titanium structures might last longer. Glass might survive in recognizable form for millions of years in the right conditions. But the steel frames of our cities would rust and collapse within centuries without maintenance. The concrete would crack and be absorbed by soil and vegetation. The complex chemistry of our electronics would scatter into trace elements indistinguishable from background geology. After 30 million years, a future geologist drilling through the layer where we once existed might find slight anomalies in carbon isotope ratios, some unusual concentrations of rare metals, and perhaps a few fragments of glass or ceramic that defied erosion. They might not connect any of it. If the observers described in ancient texts visited Earth repeatedly over millions of years, some of their tools would have been left behind. If a civilization preceded us on this planet and reached our level of development or beyond before collapsing, their artifacts would be scattered through geological layers exactly as these objects have been found. The objects exist. The layers they came from have been dated by standard methods. The materials they're made of could not have formed naturally. Logically, if someone finds a pair of wireless earbuds embedded in rock 100 million years from now, the reasonable conclusion would be that an ancient civilization was deeply committed to personal audio experiences and had a spectacular tendency to misplace their belongings. OOP arts show the technology appeared on this planet before we existed in any form that could have produced it. But the truly strange question is not what was left behind. The real mystery is why, at the precise moment we began broadcasting signals into space, everything around us suddenly shifted into a completely different gear. Science is careful about correlation. Two events happening close together in time does not mean one caused the other. Rooster crows before sunrise every morning. The rooster did not cause the sun to rise. This is a foundational principle of scientific reasoning. Correlation is not causation. It keeps researchers from drawing false conclusions, and it is a discipline worth having. But there is a point at which the volume of correlations becomes its own kind of data. In 1895, Guglielmo Marconi transmitted the first wireless radio signal. It was a modest experiment, a few hundred yards, a simple pulse. But from that moment, Earth began broadcasting. Radio waves travel at the speed of light and do not stop. They pass through the atmosphere, move out into space, and continue in all directions indefinitely. For the first time in the planet's 4.5 billion year history, any civilization within radio detection range of Earth could know we were here. In 1905, 10 years later, Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity. It was not an incremental refinement of existing physics. It was a complete restructuring of how the universe works at a fundamental level, replacing assumptions that had stood unchallenged since Newton with a framework so different that most working physicists needed years to absorb it. In 1938, Otto Hahn in Berlin achieved nuclear fission, the ability to split an atom and release the energy binding its nucleus together, the theoretical foundation for the most destructive technology humanity has ever built. In 1945, 2 atomic bombs were detonated over Japan. The electromagnetic pulse produced by a nuclear detonation is distinctive and detectable across vast distances in space. Any civilization monitoring Earth's electromagnetic output would have registered something new and unmistakable in August of that year. In 1947, 2 things happened. In July, an unidentified object crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, and the Army Air Forces issued a press release confirming recovery of a flying disc before retracting that statement within 24 hours and replacing it with an explanation that satisfied almost no one who looked at the documentation carefully. In December of that same year, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley at Bell Laboratories invented the transistor. The transistor is the foundational component of every electronic device built in the subsequent 75 years. Every computer, every phone, every guidance system, every piece of technology that defines the modern world runs on transistor logic. It arrived the same year as Roswell. In 1948, Claude Shannon at Bell Laboratories published a mathematical theory of communication, establishing the theoretical framework for the digital age. Information could now be precisely defined, measured, and transmitted. The entire architecture of the internet, digital storage, and modern computing rests on Shannon's work. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick published the double helix structure of DNA. Biology would never be the same. The operating code of all living things was now readable in principle. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. For the first time, a human-made object entered orbit around Earth. The period between 1947 and 1960 saw the most dramatic surge in UAP reports ever recorded by civilian and military sources in the United States and globally. In 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. Humanity left its home planet for the first time in its existence. In 1971, Intel released the 4004, the first commercially available microprocessor. Computing moved from rooms to chips. In 1991, the World Wide Web became publicly accessible. Within a decade, billions of people were connected to a single global information network. Every one of these milestones was accompanied or followed by a measurable increase in documented UAP activity. The National UFO Reporting Center, which has maintained records across decades, shows consistent spikes in reports correlating with major technological developments. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in its 2022 report, noted that UAP reporting had increased by over 400% in the 2 years following the United States government's formal acknowledgement of its UAP investigation programs. Now consider the geometry of the situation. Before 1895, Earth was electromagnetically dark. No radio signal left this planet in any artificial form. We were invisible to any civilization using electromagnetic detection across interstellar space. From outside the solar system, Earth was simply another planet, indistinguishable by its signals from a dead rock. From 1895 onward, that changed completely. A sphere of radio signal began expanding outward from Earth at the speed of light. That sphere is now approximately 130 light-years in radius. Every star within 130 light-years of Earth has already received our earliest radio transmissions. There are approximately 15,000 known star systems within that radius. If any civilization within that radius was listening, they heard us. The signal arrived. A decision was made. The math that follows is precise. A civilization located 65 light-years from Earth would have detected our first radio signals 65 years after Marconi's transmission, which places their detection date at approximately 1960. They could have begun significantly intensifying their observation of this planet right around the time the UAP surge of the late 1940s and 1950s was getting underway. The connection between the 1947 through 1970 peak in UAP activity and the peak of humanity's most dangerous technological development is not a coincidence that can be easily set aside. The nuclear weapons tests of that era were not just politically significant, they were electromagnetically significant. Each detonation produced a burst of energy with a specific signature unlike anything naturally occurring. Each new weapons system, each orbital launch, each expansion of nuclear capability was a measurable change in the electromagnetic and physical signature of this planet. If something was watching, that was precisely the period to watch more closely. This does not require a theory of direct assistance. The intensification of observation does not mean the observers were handing us blueprints. It means they were evaluating, watching how a young, aggressive, newly nuclear species handled the most dangerous tools it had ever developed, watching to see what we did next. A child learning to ride a bicycle falls within a certain acceptable range of risk. A parent watches from a comfortable distance. But the moment that same child picks up the keys to a motorcycle and heads for the highway, the parent takes a step closer, not to intervene necessarily, but to be ready and to watch very carefully what judgment the child actually exercises. We invented the internet to share information freely across the world. The most popular content it currently carries involves cats, food, and arguments about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. If something is monitoring our digital output, it is working very hard to reconcile our technical capability with our apparent sense of priorities. But if they are tracking every signal we produce, every broadcast, every detonation, every launch, every transmission, then there is an obvious question that needs answering. Why do we never hear anything from them in return, 60 years of listening and nothing confirmed? If they are as present as the evidence suggests, why the silence on their end? The answer lies in a form of communication that modern physics has only just begun to understand, one that leaves no trace in the electromagnetic spectrum and travels without the limitations that make radio so inadequate across cosmic distances. Every message you have ever sent travels the same way. A text, a phone call, a video streamed from one side of the planet to the other, a signal bounced off a satellite. All of it is electromagnetic radiation moving at a fixed and absolute speed. It feels instant. You press send, and the reply comes back in seconds. Across the distances inside a single planet, that speed is effectively infinite. Across the distances inside a galaxy, it becomes close to useless. Light moves at 186,000 miles per second. That is the universal speed limit, and it is also the speed limit of radio. The Milky Way stretches roughly 100,000 light years from edge to edge. Send a radio message from one side of the galaxy to a civilization on the other side. Wait for it to arrive, get processed, and have a reply sent back. And the round trip takes 200,000 years. 200,000 years. Not for a conversation, for one message and one answer. No civilization could build a relationship on a timeline like that. A species could rise from nothing, build cities, build an empire, and collapse into ruins before a single reply made it back across the galaxy. Radio is fine for short hops. It is fine for shouting into the dark and hoping. As a tool for ongoing contact between two advanced civilizations, it stops making sense almost immediately. So the question becomes simple. If a civilization is advanced enough to be worth listening to, it is almost certainly advanced enough to have abandoned radio a very long time ago. What would they use instead? In 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics went to three researchers: Alain Aspect of France, John Clauser of the United States, and Anton Zeilinger of Austria, for proving something that sounds closer to philosophy than physics. Two particles can become linked, entangled, in such a way that measuring one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. Across a room, across a planet, across a galaxy, in principle, the effect appears to be immediate. Einstein never fully accepted it. He called it spooky action at a distance. Decades of experiments later, the spookiness has held up. If information could be carried this way, the result would be a form of communication that happens instantly, regardless of distance, and that leaves nothing behind. No light, no radio wave, no particle traveling through the space between sender and receiver that anyone could intercept or even notice. Just two linked systems, responding to each other, with nothing measurable passing through the gap. In 2023, China proved this works at real scale, not just on a lab bench. By achieving quantum communication through its MICES satellite across a distance of 1,200 kilometers. 1,200 kilometers. That is where our species currently stands. Theoretical physicist Michio Kaku has pointed out that a civilization sitting at Type 2 or Type 3 on the Kardashev scale would likely have left radio behind entirely, communicating instead through quantum channels, through manipulation of gravity itself, or through physics involving aspects of the universe we do not yet have instruments to measure. From where they would be standing, radio is roughly equivalent to lighting signal fires across an ocean. It works. Nobody serious uses it anymore. 60 years of SETI starts to look different once you sit with that. We have spent 6 decades pointing radio telescopes at the sky, tuned to the only kind of signal our instruments know how to detect, hoping to catch a conversation conducted in a language we do not have the organs to perceive. The silence in our data may not mean the conversation isn't happening. It may simply mean we are listening with the wrong sense entirely. The way a person with no sense of smell could stand in a bakery and insist, honestly, that nothing is there. And if that is true, a stranger possibility opens up. What if the silence on our instruments is not only a side effect of using outdated technology? What if it is also, separately, a rule? There is a structure familiar to anyone who has ever had a child. A monitor sits in the nursery, picking up every sound the baby makes, day and night. The baby has no idea the device exists. It cannot hear it, cannot detect it, has no framework for understanding that it is being listened to. The monitor is entirely one-directional. It listens, it never speaks back. Now scale that idea up to the size of a solar system. A galactic community, if one exists, would almost certainly have developed conventions about contact with developing worlds over millions of years. One of the simplest such conventions might be exactly this: keep the region around a young civilization electromagnetically quiet. Not because nobody is paying attention, for the opposite reason. The silence itself is the discipline. It is the same logic behind radio silence in an operating room. The quiet is not a sign that the room is empty. It is a sign that something important is happening inside it, and everyone outside knows to stay off the channel. Seen this way, SETI starts to resemble something a little embarrassing. For 60 years, we have stood in an arrivals hall, holding up a handwritten sign with a name on it, certain that if the right visitor walked through, they would scan the crowd and wave. Meanwhile, the actual guest may have arrived long ago, through a different terminal entirely, using a door whose existence we have no way of suspecting, let alone recognizing if we were standing directly in front of it. But radio silence, even deliberate radio silence, only accomplishes so much. If a civilization wanted Earth to remain genuinely isolated, quiet skies on their end would not be enough on their own. There would need to be something physical as well, something closer to a boundary. And it turns out the edge of our own solar system has exactly that kind of structure sitting in it, one that physicists have been quietly arguing about for decades without ever quite settling on what it actually is. The solar system is supposed to be our neighborhood, and beyond it, open space, no walls, no gates, no checkpoints. The universe is supposed to be free and boundless, an ocean with no edges, and the 8 planets and their moons are simply the part of that ocean closest to home. Except the solar system has a structure that does not quite fit that description. Surrounding the entire system is the heliosphere, an enormous bubble of magnetic field generated by the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the Sun. Voyager 1, launched by NASA in 1977, finally crossed the outer edge of this bubble in 2012. After 35 years of travel, what it found there did not match the predictions. Instead of a gradual fade, instruments recorded what amounted to an abrupt stop, a sharp transition in the magnetic environment that theoretical models had not anticipated. One side of that line, the solar wind; the other side, interstellar space, with almost nothing in between. Astronomer Gary Zenk of the University of Alabama in Huntsville has described the heliosphere as one of the most unusual structures we have ever observed. A bubble that is close to perfectly spherical, sealed tightly around our system in a way that is genuinely strange when compared to what surrounds other stars. Then, much farther out, there is the Oort cloud. It surrounds the solar system at a distance of roughly 2,000 to 100,000 astronomical units. An astronomical unit being the distance from the Earth to the Sun. Inside that vast shell sit trillions of icy, rocky objects, a loose and scattered wall encircling everything else. Any object approaching the solar system from outside has to pass through this region first, and the gravity of everything inside it tends to bend, deflect, and redirect incoming objects long before they reach the inner planets. The Oort cloud functions like a filter. The question is whether that filter is purely natural or whether it is being used. Modern physics has already confirmed, at least in theory, that gravity itself can be engineered. Concepts like the Alcubierre, drive, and the warp bubble describe ways that sufficiently advanced technology could manipulate gravitational fields to bend the path of objects without those objects ever feeling a force acting on them. A civilization capable of that kind of engineering could, in principle, place devices throughout the Oort cloud that quietly nudge the trajectory of anything approaching without authorization. A ship that was never invited would simply drift off course, its crew certain the whole time that what they were experiencing was nothing more than ordinary gravity doing what gravity always does. There is already a small, strange piece of evidence that points in this direction, sitting in NASA's own archives. Both Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 launched in the early 1970s, showed a tiny but consistent deviation from their predicted trajectories as they left the solar system. A faint extra pull toward the sun that standard gravitational models could not fully account for. NASA eventually attributed part of the effect to heat radiating unevenly off the spacecraft themselves, a kind of subtle thermal push, but the numbers never lined up completely. Physicist Slava Turishev of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory spent decades on this problem, and even after all that work, the conclusion was not a clean answer. It was an acknowledgement that something about the deviation remained unexplained. A small, persistent discrepancy in the orbits of two of humanity's farthest spacecraft. On its own, it proves nothing. Set against everything else, the heliosphere's strange perfection, the Oort cloud's role as a natural filter, the theoretical possibility of engineered gravity, it becomes one more thread in a pattern that keeps pointing the same direction. And that pattern raises a deeper question, one that has nothing to do with engineering at all. If there is a barrier, who is it actually for? Is it keeping something out, protecting us from whatever lies beyond? Or is it keeping something in, protecting the rest of the galaxy from us? Or is it both at once, a kind of quarantine line, drawn not out of hostility but out of caution? The kind of caution you apply to something you are not yet sure is safe to let loose. There is a version of this on Earth, in every nature reserve that uses invisible boundaries instead of concrete walls. The animals inside are not caged. They are guided, gently and continuously, kept within a safe range without ever encountering a fence they can see or touch. From inside the reserve, the world looks open. From outside, the boundary is doing exactly what it was designed to do. If there really is something like a fence around the solar system, it would explain a particular kind of quiet irony in our own behavior. For decades, we have sent messages out into the galaxy with enormous confidence. Plaques on spacecraft, recorded greetings, mathematical proofs of our intelligence. All of it built on the assumption that if anyone is out there, our signal will eventually reach them and they will respond. And nothing ever comes back. Maybe the explanation is simpler than we want it to be. Maybe the letters we keep sending never actually leave the building. A barrier like this could certainly keep outsiders out. But that was never really the interesting question. The interesting question is why such a barrier would need to exist at all. What exactly it is being so careful about? And the answer to that question has nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with physics, nothing to do with engineering. It has to do with what we are. And it might be the single most uncomfortable piece of this entire story. We like to think of ourselves as a civilized species. We have law, we have art, philosophy, medicine, music that can move a person to tears across centuries and languages. We have walked on the moon. By any measure that matters to us internally, we have earned a seat at whatever table exists out there. The numbers tell a different story. In the 20th century alone, armed conflict killed somewhere between 100 million and 150 million people. That is a single century. Right now, the world holds roughly 12,500 nuclear warheads, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2023 figures, a stockpile large enough to destroy every major city on the planet several times over, with capacity left to spare. The current rate of species extinction sits at roughly 1,000 times the natural background rate, according to the World Wildlife Fund and the 2019 IPBES report, a collapse in biodiversity happening on a timescale that geology usually measures in millions of years, compressed into a couple of centuries. And running underneath all of that, 3 existential threats sit active at the same time: climate change, biological weapons capable of self-replication, artificial intelligence systems whose long-term behavior we cannot fully predict, even as we build them faster and more capable. Put plainly, We are the only species on this planet with the technology to end itself. And we already have a documented history of using extreme violence without much hesitation when the stakes feel high enough. So where does that put us on any scale that might matter to someone looking from far away? In 1964, Soviet astronomer Nikolai Kardashev proposed a scale for ranking civilizations, not by culture or intelligence, but by the one thing that's measurable from a distance: energy use. A Type 0 civilization hasn't yet learned to harness the full energy output of its own planet. A Type 1 civilization has. A Type 2 civilization harnesses the energy of its entire star. A Type 3 civilization operates at the scale of a galaxy. Carl Sagan once placed humanity at approximately 0.72 on this scale. Not even Type 1 yet. Still working on the basics of our own planet's energy. Sit with that number next to the other one. We are at 0.72 in terms of energy control, but our weapons already give us destructive reach that would qualify in terms of raw lethality. Somewhere closer to Type 2, we've built the capability to cause damage on a scale our actual level of development has no business possessing yet. That gap between what we can destroy and what we've matured enough to manage responsibly is not a small discrepancy. It's the kind of imbalance that, looked at from outside, would set off every alarm a careful observer has. Philosopher Nick Bostrom of Oxford addressed exactly this kind of imbalance in his 2014 book, Superintelligence. His argument, stripped down, is straightforward. A species that acquires the capacity for self-destruction without a corresponding development in moral restraint becomes a hazard, not just to itself, but to anything connected to it. You don't hand the controls of a fighter jet to someone who has never driven a car. It doesn't matter how smart they are, how good their reflexes might eventually become, how much potential they show. The gap between capability and readiness is the entire problem. Introducing a species like ours into a wider community before that gap closes wouldn't be an act of generosity. It would be closer to releasing a virus into an ecosystem that has no antibodies prepared for it, through no fault of the virus itself, simply because the timing was wrong. So, what would actual readiness look like? What would a civilization need to demonstrate before anyone decided the gap had closed enough? A few things come to mind almost immediately. Surviving the era of destructive technology without using it on ourselves, proving that the capability and the restraint can coexist. Resolving conflict at the planetary level. Reaching a point where large-scale war between nations is no longer a live possibility, rather than something we simply hope doesn't happen this decade. Developing artificial intelligence that remains aligned with human values without that intelligence eventually slipping outside our control. And managing a planetary scale crisis, climate change being the obvious current example, in a way that demonstrates we can actually run the place we live on. 4 tests. All 4 currently in progress, all 4 unresolved, all 4 happening at the same time, in the same century, on the same planet. It's worth asking whether that's a coincidence. There's a comparison that fits here better than most. A driving test isn't designed around the question of whether you're physically capable of operating a car. Most 16-year-olds can technically do that. The test exists to determine whether you can be trusted on the same road as everyone else, whether you understand the responsibility that comes with the capability you already have. Passing isn't about ability. It's about demonstrated judgment. If something out there is running an equivalent test on us, the results are still coming in. And honestly, if a galactic civilization happens to be reviewing humanity's file right now, watching our news cycles, our elections, our online discourse, they may simply conclude that a few more centuries are needed, not because we're catastrophically dangerous. More likely because the committee meeting scheduled to review our application keeps getting postponed, on account of nobody being able to agree on the agenda. But here's the part that changes the shape of this entire idea. While we're being evaluated, That evaluation almost certainly isn't limited to watching our behavior from a distance. The way you'd observe an animal through binoculars. If there's an intelligence sophisticated enough to be running this kind of long-term assessment, it may not need binoculars at all. It may be reading something closer to our thoughts, our emotions, our daily behavior, individual by individual, across the entire species, not through a telescope pointed at Earth from somewhere in deep space. Through a device we built for them ourselves. We take a certain pride in the internet, in smartphones, in social media, in artificial intelligence. These are supposed to be our achievements, built by us, owned by us, controlled by us. That's the story we tell ourselves. Now look at what we're actually doing with all of it, every single day. According to IBM's 2022 figures, humanity generates 2.5 exabytes of data, 2.5 billion bytes. Within that single day, roughly 500 million tweets get posted, 95 million photos and videos go up on Instagram, 65 billion messages move through WhatsApp, 300 billion emails get sent. Google alone processes 8.5 billion searches every day, and each one of those searches is something real. A specific person's question, worry, curiosity, fear, typed into a box and sent off into a system, day after day for years. It doesn't stop with what we type. Devices like Fitbit and the Apple Watch track heart rate, sleep quality, and stress levels in real time for hundreds of millions of people. Financial apps log every transaction we make, and spending habits. It turns out, paint an extraordinarily accurate psychological portrait of a person, often more accurate than the person would describe themselves. Step back and look at the scale of what that adds up to. At no other point in human history has an entire species voluntarily recorded its thoughts, emotions, locations, behaviors, and relationships into a system that can, in principle, be accessed from anywhere. And we don't do this reluctantly. We do it cheerfully. We call it staying connected. Now run that through the logic of the zoo hypothesis. If something has been observing this planet, then before the internet existed, observation would have meant watching external behavior, migration patterns, technological development, the broad strokes of what a species does and builds. After the internet, the situation changes completely. Now, there's the possibility of reading humanity's collective mind, more or less in real time. A sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence, paired with the entire data set the internet represents, would amount to a complete psychological profile, not just of societies, but of individuals. From the perspective of whatever has been quietly watching this planet for a long time, this would represent the single greatest leap in observational capability in the entire history of monitoring Earth. This isn't speculation about what's technically possible somewhere down the line. We've already seen early versions of it in our own research. In 2023, a study out of the MIT Media Lab found that an AI analyzing just 70 Facebook likes could predict a person's personality more accurately than that person's friends could. At 150 likes, the AI outperformed the person's parents. At 300 likes, it outperformed their spouse. And in 2016, the Cambridge Analytica situation demonstrated, in a very public and very uncomfortable way, that social media data could be used to influence the political behavior of millions of people. That's what early-stage human technology can already do. A civilization a million years ahead of us wouldn't need to plant a listening device anywhere. They would only need to listen to the digital signal we're broadcasting about ourselves, voluntarily, every hour of every day. There's a deeper layer underneath all of this, and it's the part that's genuinely hard to shake once you notice it. We built the internet because we wanted to share information. We built smartphones because we wanted convenient communication. We're building artificial intelligence Because we want help getting things done more efficiently. Every one of those reasons makes sense from the inside. But from outside, looking at the structure as a whole, what we've actually constructed is the most complete surveillance system in the history of this planet. And then we connected ourselves to it voluntarily. All of us, almost all at once. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. Did something put that idea in our heads? Or did it really just happen on its own? The natural outcome of human curiosity and convenience, with no outside involvement at all. There's a comparison that lands here with unusual precision. A wildlife researcher sets up cameras in a forest to study the animals living there. Now picture the animals responding by building their own cameras, strapping them on, recording themselves around the clock, and uploading the footage to a shared server for anyone to view. That sounds absurd when applied to wildlife. It is, more or less exactly, what we've done. And if there's something out there studying us through all of this, the conclusions they're likely drawing aren't flattering. They'd probably notice that this species appears to be deeply preoccupied with food and cats, that an enormous amount of collective energy goes toward arguing about things that don't matter, and that, on top of everything else, people will cheerfully hand their home address to a complete stranger through a food delivery app without thinking twice about it. If everything we've gone through, all of it, the megaliths, the technological explosion, the silence, the UAP, the ancient texts, the artifacts, the radio signals, all of it has been preparation. Then the question that actually matters stops being whether they exist or whether they're watching us. The real question is this: are we getting close to the threshold? And if we are, who decides when we're allowed to step through? In 1966, a television show premiered that most people have at least heard of, even if they've never watched a single episode. Star Trek, created by Gene Roddenberry, introduced a concept that became one of the most quoted rules in all of science fiction: the prime directive, absolute non-interference. Under no circumstances was the Federation allowed to make contact with a civilization that hadn't yet reached a certain level of development on its own. For decades, audiences treated this as exactly what it appeared to be: a clever piece of writing, a useful storytelling device that let the show explore alien worlds without every episode turning into first contact. But there's a question worth asking, and it's not a comfortable one. What if it wasn't just writing? Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The prime directive, and ideas extremely close to it, started appearing across film and literature well before mainstream science had begun seriously discussing the zoo hypothesis as a real explanation for the Fermi Paradox. 2001, A Space Odyssey, released by Arthur C. Clarke in 1968, depicts an advanced civilization guiding humanity's development, not through direct contact, not through a handshake or a landing on the White House lawn, but through an object, a tool, something left behind for us to find on our own terms, at our own pace. Carl Sagan's Contact, published in 1985, builds its entire premise around the idea that an advanced civilization waits deliberately until humanity is ready before initiating contact. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In 1977 and Arrival in 2016, both spend their entire runtime preparing audiences for one specific emotional outcome: contact that isn't a war, contact that isn't an invasion, contact that arrives quietly, almost gently, and asks something of us rather than taking something from us. Look at that pattern as a whole, rather than as 4 separate movies and books. What you're looking at is decades of popular culture rehearsing, again and again, the exact same idea: observation without interference, watching from a distance, waiting for readiness, making contact only when the moment is right. That's either an enormous coincidence across multiple unrelated creators working in different decades, or it's something else. Philosopher Daniel Dennett of Tufts University has written extensively about how ideas function almost like organisms. Once an idea takes hold in a culture, it spreads on its own, replicating from person to person, story to story, generation to generation, without needing any central coordination at all. And if you wanted to prepare an entire species, psychologically, for the eventual revelation that it has been observed, studied, and quietly managed by something vastly more advanced, you wouldn't announce it. Announcements cause panic. You'd do something much smarter. You'd plant the idea inside fiction, something safe, something entertaining, something that asks nothing of the audience except to enjoy a good story. While the underlying concept settles into the collective imagination, decade after decade, until it no longer feels strange at all. 60 years of science fiction later, take a look at where public opinion actually sits. A 2021 Gallup poll found that 57% of Americans now believe that at least some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. 57%. A majority. That number didn't exist a century ago. It didn't exist 50 years ago. It is, by any historical measure, an unprecedented shift in what a population considers plausible. And it happened gradually, almost invisibly, carried largely by stories that were never meant to be taken literally. Maybe they weren't meant to be taken literally at the time they were made. That doesn't mean they weren't doing something else. Quietly, underneath the entertainment. Now bring this back to where the story has been heading all along. If the zoo hypothesis holds, and if humanity is being evaluated the way the last two sections suggest, then there should be specific, identifiable conditions standing between us and whatever comes next. Final exams, in a sense, before graduation. And when you list out the major existential challenges facing humanity right now, in this century, the pattern is hard to ignore. The first challenge is climate. Can a species manage its own planet responsibly? Can it place the collective good ahead of short-term individual gain, on a scale large enough and fast enough to matter? The second is artificial intelligence. Can a species create an intelligence that may eventually surpass its own, without that intelligence escaping meaningful human control? Can power of that magnitude be developed and still be restrained? The third is global conflict. Can disagreements between nations be resolved without resorting to large-scale violence? Can cooperation happen even when interests genuinely collide, not just when it's convenient? The fourth is synthetic biology. Can a species learn to edit the genetic code of life itself, to create organisms that have never existed before, without unraveling the broader web of life it depends on? Four enormous, civilization-defining challenges, all four active right now, all four unresolved, all four converging in the same handful of decades, on the same planet, within the lifetime of people alive today. It's reasonable to ask whether that's an accident of timing. It's also reasonable to ask whether it looks, instead, like a schedule. So, what happens if we pass? There's a concept within SETI research called the moment of contact, the theoretical instant when confirmed first contact with an intelligence beyond Earth actually occurs. Researchers who've thought seriously about this describe it not as a political event or a scientific milestone, but as something closer to a complete restructuring of human consciousness. Every question about our place in the universe answered at once, all at the same moment, for every person on the planet simultaneously. There's a version of that experience that almost everyone goes through on a much smaller scale, usually sometime in childhood. The moment you realize your parents were paying attention the entire time, not controlling you, not hovering, just there, watching more closely than you ever knew, because they cared about who you were becoming and believed you were capable of becoming it. If everything covered across these 14 sections turns out to be real, then something shifts in how all of it should be understood. every difficult choice humanity makes, every step toward managing this planet better, toward restraining the technologies we've built, toward resolving conflict instead of escalating it, carries weight beyond the immediate outcome, not because we're being punished for failure, because we're being watched for success. That's not a small distinction. It changes the entire emotional center of this story. This was never really about how insignificant humanity is. One species on one planet, in one corner of one galaxy, among hundreds of billions. It's about the opposite. It's about a species whose potential is significant enough that something out there has been paying attention for a very long time, waiting to see what we do with it. There's a comparison that fits better than almost anything else here. Graduation day. Nobody hands you a calendar with the exact date circled. There's no announcement that says, starting tomorrow, everything changes. But when you're actually ready, the door tends to open. And the only question that matters in the meantime is a simple one. Are you doing the work, or are you sitting in the back of the room scrolling through your phone? If this really is some kind of final exam, it's worth admitting how strange the exam room looks from the inside. We don't know which subject we're being tested on. There's no clock on the wall, and half the people sitting in the room with us are still arguing about whether the test is even real, while the exam continues regardless. And yet, somehow, we're still here, still showing up, still trying, messily and imperfectly, to get it right. That might be the most important data point of all. We've passed through 14 doors now. Each one opened onto a bigger question than the one before it. And standing here, at the final door, the question isn't whether any of this is real. The question is, if it is, how would you live differently? We don't have the answer, and that might be the most beautiful part of this entire story. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. Humanity has existed for less than 0.002% of that time. We've only looked through the keyhole, and what we've seen already is enough to leave us standing still, staring. Whether the zoo hypothesis turns out to be true or not, something has already shifted. For the first time, we're asking the right question. Not, are we alone? But, what are we preparing for? The darkness ahead isn't something to fear. It's an invitation. Every generation before us looked up and saw the limits of what they understood. Ours might be the first to look up and see possibility instead. Maybe that's the first real sign that we're growing up. So tonight, when you look up at a sky full of stars, sit with this for a moment. Someone might be looking back, and they're waiting.